This year, we are celebrating the centenary year of Professor K.N. Raj, Professor Kakadan Nandanath Raj, and we have got very distinguished speakers, starting from Professor Geeta Sen and Professor R. Nagaraj, Professor P.S. Vijay Shankar. And this meeting will be presided over by the President of Odisha Economic Association, Professor Abhinarayana Patra. And the meeting will be moderated by Professor Kesav Das, who is the editor of Odisha Economic Journal, and he is also the former president of Odisha Economic Association. Currently, he is the dean at the School of Economics and Commerce at KIT University. And the president of Odisha Economic Association, Professor Abhinarayan Patra, is currently a visiting professor at Courts Koraput. That's basically Tribal Research Institute at Koraput. And he was a deputy director at Gopalbandhu Academy of Administration. That institute basically imparts training to the bureaucrats of Odisha. And he was also a teacher for a long time at the prestigious Relevance College. So I did not give the introduction of the speakers because Professor Kesav Das, the moderator of the session, will do that in details. That's why I did not do that. So with that, okay, so I welcome Professor Rabinaran Patra to preside over this meeting, after which Professor Kesav Das, who will take over the session. But before we get into this, I will tell very briefly about Professor K.N. Raj, and particularly my interaction with Professor K.N. Raj. I have met only once with Professor K.N. Raj, and that was basically after the BOG meeting that happens at CDS, followed by a dinner. And I had very brief interaction with him. And then when I told that I am from Odisha, then immediately, he talked about Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Okay, and of course as a Professor Pule Naik. So and that was very brief interaction. But after that, I think he did not keep well, and then he did not come to CDS very frequently. But in fact, I was also there on the day of his death. I would say, 10th of February. 2010, I was about to leave CDS. I left CDS in March, and before that, actually, Professor K.N. Raj passed away. And in fact, we all were there during his cremation, and we had gone to the crematorium also. So I had very brief interaction with Professor K.N. Raj, and then we had just got to a small memento during our MPhil welcome ceremony. And in that memento, it is written that when this planning used to happen, but we had read in newspaper that Professor K.N. Raj was an economic advisor to Jawaharlal Nehru at the age of 26. And then Nehru asked a question to Professor K.N. Raj that what kind of model we should adopt, growth model we should adopt for our country. And then Professor K.N. Raj asked a counter question to Nehru that if you have to choose between growth and democracy, what will you choose, sir? And then Nehru, of course, responds that it is democracy that will give priority than the economic growth. So that's how actually, I'll briefly tell about Professor K.N. Raj. Now, I welcome all of you who all have joined for this meeting, and I'm really thankful to all the distinguished speakers, who agreed, like Professor Geeta Sen told, that it's a Sunday, and you all have sacrificed Sunday, because actually, it's in honor of Professor K.N. Raj, and of course, the spirit of CDS. Can see a lot of alumni of CDS are present in this meeting. So with that brief note, may I now request the president of OEA, Professor Abhinarayan Patra, to preside over the meeting and to give his introductory remark. Over to you, sir. Ravi, sir. You can unmute and start speaking.
So thank you, Amarendra. Namaskar to all. Good evening. Actually, I am a bit innocent about K.N. Raj accepting I remember when I was a student of first year BA Economics Honors, my teacher introduced me to K.N. Raj through the textbook. And it was in the context of drafting of the first 5-year plan of India and the role played by Professor Raj, particularly in setting the savings target. So that was my acquaintance, theoretical acquaintance with Professor K.M. Raj. Later, when I became a teacher teaching in the colleges, I came to know of many things about K.N. Raj, and the things that impressed me, and I am sure it must have impressed everybody also, were the following. First, he was instrumental in creating two institutions, the DSE and the CDS, which are now, I should say, public goods. The two are in the public goods domain, should be in the public goods domain. The second thing that interested me is that he was very much uh, liberal in admitting students in the sense that normally we enroll students into the MA classes with economics honors. But he was liberal to the extent I have heard that even though one didn't have any fundamental, say, degree in economics, he could also pursue his research in economics. So that was his liberal attitude. The second thing is that unlike the modern day economists who consider people without mathematics, econometrics, and all that as simple grass cutters, K.N. Raj was very thorough in economics and even using very simple percentages, tables, and all that, he could impress the audience with his blending of theory and practice. That is the second thing. The third thing was that he introduced a kind of interdisciplinary approach to social science research, economics in particular. And that was very important, and that is very important nowadays also. And the thing that impressed me most was his straightforwardness. I have heard all these things. I do not have any first-hand interaction with. I am unfortunate to that extent, but I have read many things about Professor Raj, and he was at a very personal level. His students, many of whom have joined the meeting today, including Professor Keshav Das, who is moderating, and the three eminent speakers. He was very generous. So generosity is lacking nowadays. But Professor Raj was very generous, and although he was having a very towering personality, he was very generous, and he excited very young minds to think independently and to come out with new ideas. Nowadays, what we see is that if somebody is doing research under somebody's guidance, the guide will simply say that you have all written, whatever you have written, they are all rubbish. You please refine. So the kind of refinement that is needed, nobody, very few are telling their scholars. But Professor Raj was generous to that extent that he would identify the mistakes and he would say correct them. So giving an opportunity to the scholar to think and to do things for himself. So these are very few things. I do not want to stand between the three eminent speakers who have become what they are, just like Professor K.N. Raj. So they have established themselves in their respective spheres. I do not want to stand in between. I am welcoming them to this association. We shall be very happy if they can join in future with us, not in not in this
Online.
this mode, but physical mode. And I hope, I am very hopeful that I will try my best to join the CDS meeting, even though I am a misnomer there. Thank you all. With this, I now hand over the session to Professor Das.
So very much. It's actually, let me begin by being very, very honest as to my feelings. Actually, I think I feel extremely happy. I mean, that's my real feelings now. More than I'm, of course, feeling very proud, but I think more than that, I'm feeling extremely happy seeing very, very distinguished teachers, friends in the audience, and especially the three very, very extremely well-known and very, very committed teachers amongst us. As all of us know that this is true, so we are essentially celebrating Professor K.M. Raj, who sort of has impressed us not just as a teacher or institution builder or someone who contributed to policy, but also here in his own times, I think he was quite controversial. Not all that he said was always easily accepted by everyone. But at the same time, I was also told that people who would not, people in high places, including, let's say, people like Mrs. Indira Gandhi or even within Kerala, very top left leaders, with whom I mean he largely disagreed, but then on various occasions, they're the ones who sort of sought his advice. So that probably tells a lot about a human being whose commitment, whose integrity was not in question. Apart from that, I mean, sort of like very, very briefly, I do not want to waste time on that. I read somewhere in the history of this school that even during his time in the Delhi school as a teacher, he used to even sort of direct Shakespearean plays. So that was something very special about him. So a person with a lot of interest, and I was told that when he was with the planning commission, particularly during the lunch breaks, he would sort of burst into laughter and sort of like very, very, he had a great sense of humor, and all that I think made him a very special human being. Apart from the fact that he contributed immensely to the larger domain of knowledge and discourses on development, growth, and democracy. So I will be hearing more from that from these three very distinguished speakers that we have. So let me sort of very quickly introduce three of them to the audience. I'm not very sort of sure that whether actually they need any special introduction, but let me start with Professor Geeta Sen. I think she is very, very well-known scholar. She is a feminist political economist, and she did her master's at the Delhi School and had a PhD from the Stanford University. And so she has worked on a variety of issues, particularly focusing on women's labor, poverty, population policies, and the social and commercial determinants of health. And she has been sort of over 4 decades of experience in sort of advising various governments, both at the national and at the international levels. So focusing on issues relating to gender equality and women's human rights. She had been a fantastic teacher, and in fact, I happen to be too lucky to be her student during my entry days many decades back. And she spent, in fact, she was initially, she was most known as one of the most prominent teachers, one of the star teachers, if I may say, at the Center for Development Studies during the 80s. So she was there for about a decade. And before she sort of moved to the Harvard University as a visiting professor during 1991 to 93. And for a long time, she was sort of more or less settled in Bangalore, and she was a professor at the Indian Institute of Management for a very long time, for almost 2 decades from 1993. She held also the Ratan Tata Chair Professor there, and she became a distinguished professor and director, later director of the Ramalinga Swamy Center on Equity and Social Determinants of Health at the Public Health Foundation of India, so where she is currently a distinguished professor and a senior advisor. Very specially, apart from huge number of papers she has written, talks she has given. She is also one of the founding members of the very well-known journal called Dawn, that's the Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. And she has been advising governments at various levels. And some of the positions she held include as the co-chair of the Gender and Rights Advisory Panel of the World Health Organization, and she had been on the governing boards of UNRIST, United Nations University, and she has been a member of the governing body of the National Health Systems Resources Center, the Mission Steering Group, the National Rural Health Mission, and the high-level expert group on universal health care set up by the Planning Commission. Is widely published, and of course, we are not surprised that she has received some of the most prestigious awards, including the Volvo Environment Prize, the Dan David Prize, and honorary doctorates from University of East Anglia, the Carolina Institute in Stockholm, the Open University in UK, the University of Sussex, and the University of Edinburgh. So that is still a brief introduction to a great teacher and a great thinker and a great activist in our midst. So Geeta Sen, Madam, most welcome. We are so very happy that you are with us in this Odisha Economic Association. So let me move on to the next speaker, who is again known as distinguished Professor R. Nagaraj, maybe a friend, a very, very familiar face to all of us who has been, anyone who has been working in the domain of economics in India or abroad definitely knows him, because he's one of the most frequently published authors in the economic and political weekly. So, and very often in conferences, especially relating to industrializations, relating to industrial statistics, macroeconomics, on employment. So very often I've heard from other colleagues and friends in conferences, in the bylines of the conferences, saying that if Nagaraj has given an estimate, so we do not argue any further. So because that shows his sort of commitment, and he has been a very, very hardworking scholar all through. He has a PhD in economics from the Center for Development Studies, that is the degree from the JNU. And for a long time, he had been a professor at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research in Mumbai. And currently, he is associated with the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. There is a Center for Liberal Education. He has recently joined as I think as a visiting professor, I guess. And he has taught full semester courses at the Princeton University and in the Hosei University in Japan, amongst several other places. In fact, he's one of those very sort of frequently invited speakers at several institutions, universities in India and abroad. Some of his recent works relate to his book on industrialization for employment and growth in India, lessons from small clusters and beyond, which is published by the Cambridge University Press. And his sort of very most recent paper is on an interesting topic, India's toy industry, production and trade since 2000, which has been published as a co-author paper in EPW last year. So that is again a very, very brief introduction to a very, very significant scholar in our profession. And so that takes me to the next speaker, who had a very, very unique sort of background. At this moment, he is the professor of practice at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences in Shiv Nadar University. But then he is a scholar from the Center for Development Studies during the early 80s, and very unlike many of us, and very like some of his sort of colleagues at that time, including Professor Mihir Shah, who could not join us today. In Madhya Pradesh, Professor Vijay Shankar, in fact, sort of co-founded what is known as Samaj Pragati Sahyog for a long time. I think it's almost over 30 years. They have been working with the tribals, the marginalized communities in the most deprived central Indian sort of region, so often focusing on issues relating to water, agriculture, and sort of rights of human beings in a variety of spheres. He has contributed extensively to debates in these issues on relating to natural resource management, issues relating to water, and largely sort of addressing issues of how to contribute to enhancing the livelihood options in these tribal areas. So with that, we have all these three speakers with us, and in the audience again there are very, very interesting people. So let's begin to listen to all these three, and we'll have some. So there is no such format as such. There may not be any formal presentation. So this is more, I guess, would be kind of a mix of their experiences with Professor Ken Raj and their ideas, views, perspectives on whether and how Professor Raj's ideas would be relevant in current times. So with that, very I'm so very happy again, as I said. So let me invite Professor Gita-san. So please, about 15 minutes or something, and Nagaraj and Vijay Shankar, then we'll have it. I'm looking forward to the discussion also. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Keshav, for those kind words of introduction. And also many thanks to the Odisha Economics Association for holding this event and for inviting me to be part of it. Ken Raj was one of those, someone said, a towering personality. And he was a towering personality, which was fascinating because he was about 5 feet 3 inches tall, I think. But somehow not very much taller than me. But somehow he seemed to be up there always. And there's so many facets to that fascinating personality that there are many times I feel sorry for students of today that that generation that Raj belonged to, and that so many of the other founders of CDS were also part of, are not available to them as teachers, as motivators, as inspirers, and so on. So I thought I'd just, in 15 minutes, give a touch on a few brief aspects of Professor Raj as I knew him. So I want to start off just by, who was Ken Raj? Secondly, what were his qualities that really made him stand out so much? As an economist, as an institution builder, as a teacher, and as a man as well. And a little bit about my own personal interactions with him. And I think the title of this webinar has current relevance. And that, of course, is the most tricky part of the entire discussion, to figure out the current relevance of anybody in this, in the times that we are living through. So who was Ken Raj? Ken Raj, of course, Kapilanandanath Raj was a, dyed in the wool Kerala Malayali. He was an Irava, belonging to the Iravas are a scheduled caste in Kerala, you could say on the boundaries between the upper caste Nayars and the Dalits below them. And that made them, in fact, in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, very much the seedbed for the Narayana Guru movement as well. And that in itself is a fascinating story. But if one thinks of somebody born in 1924 in the India of that time, you can see so many facets of that if you look back and think about Professor Raj. Belonging to that caste in the Kerala of that time, growing up in the heat of the nationalist movement, and then living through the period, of course, of the euphoria of independence and planning and working with the great Pandit Nehru at that time. So you could see the makings of the man in coming from many of those influences. As in 1968, when I reached the Delhi school as a student of the MA in economics, and I had been born and brought up in Pune in Maharashtra for all my life, had never been out, and had just come after a long train journey at the ripe age of 19 to join Delhi school, without never having been to Delhi in my life, and without much of a sense of what this was going to be all about. Professor Raj taught us in that very first year the course on planning. And of course, his course on planning was very focused on GNP, national accounts, stocks and flows. I still, every time I think about stocks and flows, I remember him, because that's the first time I even realized there was a difference between stocks and flows. The economics of Sir John Hicks, and none of it seemed to me to be, at that time, terribly earth-shattering. Okay, it seemed okay, you're counting how the economy works. And I always thought of him for quite some time as the macroeconomist in an environment, and you have to remember, this is 1968 Delhi school in its heyday. So Amartya Sen was there, Sukumar Chakravarti was there, Jagdish Bhagwati was there, Manmohan Singh had just come back and taught us his, we were the first batch to be taught by him international finance. So there was all of these luminaries, and somehow Professor Raj, shorter than all of them, seemed to stand out. And he was not the brilliant theorist. He was not the person who sparkled in the classroom like Amartya did. But somehow there was always seemed to be something about him that it took me quite a while to put my finger on what that was. Now, 1968, I thought of Raj as this relatively, modest macroeconomist planner. And I didn't know very much about political economy, but remember, this is the late 60s. So Naxalism and its views were all over the place and everywhere, including in Delhi. Raj had, of course, already been through the first 5-year plan, the work that he did. And there's some wonderful writing about Raj in Ashok Modi's book that is fascinating for anybody interested in Ken Raj. And Raj describes in their first meeting where Panditji was going to be present, they went and he and Anjaria went into the room and found it was absolutely filthy. So he and Professor Anjaria actually swept the room. So before Nehru would come into the room and the meeting would begin. But in 1964, Raj had written a paper called Nehru, the Congress and Class Conflict in July of 1964, which showed an extremely close knowledge of Nehru's thinking about where India's economy needed to go and how. And that was full of a class analysis, which really was not there when one thought about Raj and stocks and flows. The importance of the petty bourgeoisie, but its role in obstructing land reform, issues around how to mobilize savings, and a side that is fascinating on Nehru and communalism. That was really interesting. And he's writing this in 1964, remember, after the Chinese attack and after Nehru's death. He was writing in July. And Raj saw already the growing power of big business and of new voices arguing to remove controls on the economy. In 1973, his Kale Memorial Lecture at the Gokhale Institute, built on the work of Michal Koletsky, and of course his paper on the politics and economics of intermediate regimes, showed a very deep reading of Karl Marx. I've never heard Raj speak much about Marx, but I was fascinated in reading that to see how deep his understanding was of Marx and Marx's writings. And he talks about the tensions and the economic contradictions of an alliance of the lower middle class, rich peasants, and state capitalism, how to generate surpluses for investment, etc. Very, very interesting. I think that, to me, all of this pointed to something that I realized later, which is, as an economist, if I were to use one adjective to describe Raj, I would say his groundedness. He was completely grounded, non-dogmatic, eclectic. He had very little patience with high theory and very little and even less patience with theory that did not come from a grounding in empirical reality. That, of course, meant that there were a lot of those, particularly friends on the left, who sort of saw him as this anti-theoretical empiricist. But in fact, the reason for my telling you about the Koletsky paper and other things was to say that Raj was anything but anti-theoretical. But he worked within a political economy frame. For him, theory was a frame, not a set of tools, and not a set of rigid, if A, then B. It was a frame within which to think about the realities that he could see on the ground. So that is the way that I saw Raj's use of theory and how Raj approached theory. And he was quite eclectic in his ability. I think previous speakers spoke about how open he was to students not having to have an economics background. Raj believed that anybody could come in and learn and practice economics and political economy in a sensible, grounded way. And of course, that's what he brought to his work as an institution builder. There's a lot one can say about Delhi School. I do remember, I have a little more time, Keshav, 5 more minutes at least. Yeah.
Please.
There were because I was there at the time when Raj was a professor at the Delhi school and then became vice chancellor. And I'm not sure that his stint as vice chancellor in Delhi University was the happiest period of his life. In fact, I suspect it wasn't, because he was given a very hard time. The leftists didn't think he was a Marxist, but the rightists certainly put him in that category, and they were, baying for his blood from the minute he became vice chancellor. So it was a difficult time. But I remember my first impressions of him just as a man, those bright, shining eyes, and that booming laugh. That laugh in CDS, you'd say, yes, there's Professor Raj, because you would hear his laugh corridors away. And that was true in Delhi school as well. And a personality that, in fact, saw through. He put up, as I said, with very little cant. He couldn't stand puffery. Anybody who, put on pompous acts, Raj took great pleasure in pricking the pompousness and bringing them down to earth. As an institution builder, of course, others will also speak about this, and that's the part of him that's so well known that I won't say very much, but it says something that at the time after his stint as vice chancellor in Delhi, that he could move as far away from Delhi as anyone possibly could, to Trivandrum to set up CDS. But the kind of co-founders that he was able to attract to work with him in setting up CDS, and giving the fillip to the ICSSR other ICSSR institutions that got set up, it says something about the leadership qualities and the charisma, the intellectual charisma of the person, that he was able to bring them together. As a teacher, as I said, I was not sort of bowled over by his planning class. I learned from it, but it didn't bowl me over. But I would say there were a lot of things I learned from Professor Raj, more on a kind of informal one-to-one basis. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the world of the early 1980s, India was not the most unequal society. And Raj knew a great deal and would talk about what the meaning of inequality was through his knowledge of Brazil, for instance. And I knew nothing about Brazil. And so this was fascinating that because I had thought about gender inequality, but I had not really understood the meaning of inequality in the nuance with which Raj could speak about it at that time. Another example, which is fascinating, he once turned to me, now, me, the Tambram, who's been born and brought up in Maharashtra, had very little to do, but with my Tambram roots from in Tirunelveli district, he said, do you know why Tamil Nadu found it so easy to get rid of the Brahmin landlords? And of course, I hadn't thought about that at all. And my own family, Purvajans, my ancestry came from exactly those Mirashidars, the landowners of who then progressively lost land and then everybody left. He said, do you know why that was possible? And he was trying to explain why it was possible in Tamil Nadu and why it was so much more difficult in, say, UP or Bihar. He said, do you know what percent Brahmins ever were in Tamil Nadu? I said, not a clue. 2%. He said, you can get rid of 2% of the population very easily. You can't get rid of 14, 15%. And he said that in itself shapes demographics, and was sort of such a graphic lesson in the way in which demography and economy work together, and of course sociology, the sociology of caste, work together. So I can give you more examples of this kind, but these are things that just absolutely stuck in my head long after I'd forgotten about stocks and flows and John Hicks. Someone said, as a man, Raj was enormously, extremely generous. But I will speak about the other qualities. As a feminist economist, Raj was a patriarch of his time. If you were to ask him if gender made a difference to how he thought about anybody, he would say, absolutely, of course not. Did it do so in the sociology of his behavior? Of course it did. He belonged to his time. He was, as I said, a patriarch of his time. And coming into CDS, that of course put me working as a feminist economist, interested in looking at women and work in the economy. That put me on a bit of a collision path with Raj in terms of what I was working on. And I would hear from others, they were saying, she has so much potential. Why isn't she working on, I don't know, savings or investment or something else? And I'm not sure that I ever got through to him. And perhaps now in hindsight, I would approach him differently on that. At that time, of course, I would just get enraged. How can he not see how important it is that women predominate, women workers predominate among the poorest, work the longest hours, earn less, have fewer assets, and as agricultural laborers, they are there in very large numbers. How can he not see that this is important? Today, if I were to approach him, I would approach it through inequality. I would say you're only looking at one kind of inequality. You're not sufficiently, for someone who so deeply believes in being grounded in empirical reality, you're not seeing how other kinds of inequality intersect with the economic inequality that you give a great deal of weight and attention to. Of course, in CDS, there were others who worked greatly on inequality. There was Krishnaji, but there was also Professor Vaidyanathan, whose interest in inequality and whose ability to expand the way in which he thought about inequality meant that people like me, and of course people like Sundari, who was working on the intersections between caste, class, and gender inequality to write one of the most brilliant PhD theses done at CDS. So there were other places we could go to. But Raj was always in a sense, I would say, someone whose ideas, even if I didn't always agree with them, were elicited enormous respect. Finally, maybe in 2 minutes, current relevance. What is the current relevance? I think one of the things that was still very much the case during our time in the 1980s in CDS was that, of course, economists in the country came from all persuasions. So there were those from the left, those from the right, those in the middle, empiricists, theorists, every kind. CDS brought all of those together. And in a sense, it allowed the students and younger faculty working there to get the possibility of seeing that flow and clash of ideas and thinking in a way that I feel sorry is so little available to students of today. Today, we cannot find among the institutions that kind of breadth and variety that would allow the flow and clash of ideas out of which new ideas would emerge. And I think that for me is Raj's current relevance. The need for us as a community, as a profession, to be able to go back to that kind of cross flow of ideas, the ability to talk to those with whom ideologically or otherwise we may not be able to speak, in order to figure out what is actually happening on the ground in the country. So I'll stop with that, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so very much, Sangeeta. That's very nice. Like you also not just talked about Raj's interests and kind of very broad sort of perspectives on the society, perspectives on how to teach and all. But I also, it was very nice that you also brought in a lot of your personal experiences. So I'm sure we will have a lot to hear again from the other two speakers. And after that, we will go for some question and answer. So Nagaraj, please, Professor Nagaraj, please.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Keshav. Thank you, Amarendra, for this invitation. I'm happy to step in for my classmate, Mihirsha. As he's not keeping well, I hope I can do justice to the task assigned to me. I think it was Pramit Bhattacharya's timely reminder about Professor K.N. Raj's birth centenary in an op-ed in the Hindustan Times woke the profession to this important event in 2024. Pramit called Professor Raj, as Geeta just now reminded us, grounded economist, enumerating his significant contributions to Indian economics, policy advice, and institution building. I'm glad Odisha Economic Association has organized the event commemorating Professor Raj's birth centenary. For my generation of economists, trained in India, working on Indian economic problems, Professor Raj's writings and policy recommendations are part of our learning and teaching. In the policymaking circles in Delhi, there used to be always the question: what would be Professor Raj's take on the economic policy of the day? This is something which one came across very often whenever we went to meet people in Delhi. So I think he had this kind of influence on the policymaking circles for 4 decades. Yeah, that's something quite an achievement. Yeah. However, if one takes a survey today of academically active economists and teachers under 40, not many may be aware of Professor Raj and his contributions. There may be reasons for this. One reason, I think, could be changes in the dominant economic discourse towards the mainstream neoclassical economics and the use of highly quantitative methods of analysis, often ignoring the historical and institutional backgrounds. So that's a difference between the kind of economics which Professor Raj did himself and encouraged, and the what's happening today. It is in this spirit that I will make this short presentation. uh, to see the relevance of Professor Raj's work for today's generation, I must start with a disclaimer that I was never Professor Raj's student. However, I was drawn to CDS because of the kind of economic questions the center's faculty addressed in their research. As an MA student, as an avid reader of EPW, we used to see CDS faculty writing in EPW, and I used to very moved by that kind of economic analysis. Quite different from what we were taught in the standard MA level economics. Moreover, I learned to appreciate Professor Raj's work much more after I left CDS. When I started working as an independent academic economist and began interacting closely with professional policymaking circles. So I think I learned more about Professor Raj's work after I left CDS than when I was in CDS. What was Professor Raj's method of doing economics? So this is my understanding, this is my take. Professor Raj is considered a left-leaning Keynesian economist, which is broadly correct. However, he was not a methodological purist. He used a variety of analytical tools to suit the purpose at hand. So he was an eclectic in his use of economics. Okay, very often he used simple Marshallian partial equilibrium analysis to elucidate an economic problem. For example, just to give an example, to explain widespread prevalence of tenant farming in India, he used a simple Marshallian analysis in his famous paper in Indian Economic Review 1969. Okay. Actually, in another situation, as Geeta explained very well, okay, he invoked Kalinski's class analysis. It's a very macroeconomic analysis of intermediate regimes to understand India's political economy. So he could do both with deep insights. So that was his ability, and also his eclecticism with respect to theory. That's important. That he started with a problem, and then saw which economic frame was illuminating it, and he would apply it. So that was his ability. Okay, and Raj's policy prescriptions were also not ideologically driven. They were pragmatic, usually motivated by careful empirical analysis with due consideration for the institutional setting. Raj often favored comparative economic analysis. In fact, I remember, as in various conversations we would have, and also during lunchtime conversations in CDS, he would often say, "Look at Japan. Look at what's happening in East Asia." So I think I would say that there was a very powerful kind of motivators, because they would make a student like me look at other countries, particularly our neighboring East Asia. Right. In particular, Raj conducted some of the best comparative analysis between India and China during the early years of planning. He drew valuable lessons for India's policy from Chinese experience. Right. And again, as Geeta rightly mentioned, he often trespassed, to use Hirschman's terminology, trespassed boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, to understand a practical problem. However, it did not mean a flippant use of terms and jargon, but such trespassing is undertaken with careful regard for the underlying theories and empirical rigor. I mean, that's the beauty of his careful trespassing. This is about his method, and I would talk about how I was influenced. Okay, I mean, that will be this personal. My PhD thesis was on subcontracting in Indian manufacturing industries. I was deeply influenced by Professor Raj's hypothesis of demand constraint on India's industrialization at that time, mainly on account of poor agricultural performance. His famous 1976 paper in EPW. However, Raj was never, again, as a theoretical purist. He was always very grounded in empirical data. As time passed in the early 80s, he changed his position. In fact, on a close reading of macroeconomic development, soon changed his argument that India in the 1980s was no longer stagnating economy and that GDP was growing, was accelerating. And I remember the entire lot of left-leaning economists in India poo-poohed what Raj said. In fact, many of our seniors said, no, I think Raj got it completely wrong this time. I, as a student, of course, I kept listening to everyone, but I think I did a careful econometric kind of, growth analysis towards second half of the 80s to show that what Raj was saying was correct. So therefore, I mean, that was his insights, that he was always grounded in macroeconomic understanding of India. Yeah, as a student, I was deeply influenced by such analysis. It has been a profound learning experience for me and has influenced my own research. Again, compared to study with China, here again, there is clear a developmental perspective, not a dogmatic theoretical position of either socialism or free markets. I remember in 1978 when China started opening the economy to domestic market forces as well as foreign trade and capital, most Indian leftist scholars were aghast at the capitalist turn of China, deviating from its socialist path. I remember there was a famous kind of a public meeting in Trivandrum where Hindu editor he spoke, and then Raj spoke on China, and then Hindu editor, given his theoretical priors, he will give a strong socialist interpretation of why China was deviating, and he gave a theoretical, political analysis of it. However, I remember this is one of my first lectures I heard of Raj when I joined CDS as a student in 1978. Okay, Raj had a different take. Raj he based on close analysis of economic performance, China's economic performance. He argued that Chinese agriculture and industrial productivity were stagnating, and they had reached a plateau. And Professor Raj argued unless there is the productivity growth, China won't be able to feed its population. And it was this dire concern that was driving China to become open to greater use of market forces, open to seek Western technology and capital. I think this was, I remember first time I heard this, quite different from the standard, I would say, leftist position. And I think with hindsight, I would say Raj's prognosis came out to be true. Yeah, as I said, I was deeply influenced by Raj's comparative analysis of China, and in my own professional life, I think I have written a couple of papers comparing India and China. So I mean, that's this I can say clearly influenced by Raj's way of looking at India and China. Yes, yeah. Again, about Raj was agnostic between, he was not ideologically driven for markets or state. That was his position. I'll give, very often people are taken by, yeah, I would say Raj was considered a left-leaning economist who often championed the concern for equity and inclusivity, and advocating state intervention as a means to correct for market failures. He also championed a nationalist economic policy. He was strongly, he was critical very often of foreign capital in India, and often cautious about free flow of foreign capital into Indian industry. However, he was not dogmatic about it, driven by theoretical priors, as often happens in Indian economic discourse. Let me illustrate with two examples. In his 1985 V.T. Krishnamacharya Memorial Lecture at IEG, Indian Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi, Professor Raj hinted at the advantages of foreign capital in acquiring advanced technology. In fact, he was again comparing China. He says, in fact, what I thought was a very famous sentence was, it's not without reason China has been hospitable to IBM. At a time when India was totally opposed, Indian, I would say broadly left of center policy view was that India should not open up and India should not be hospital, it should not be inviting foreign capital. Whereas Raj cautioned, look at how China is doing. There is probably a lesson for us. So that way, I think he was always very pragmatic and not driven by ideology. And his choice between state and market is always driven by the practical realities. Again, I would say I'll give an example from the earlier time. Here is an example from 1964. During the heydays of permit license Raj, when the state control was considered virtuous. Okay, Raj headed a committee on steel decontrol. He was the chairman of the committee, and in fact, quite surprising to many economists at that time, he said steel pricing should be decontrolled. In the sense, at that time, prices were controlled by the government. Government would decide the pricing. But he argued that was not good and that should be decontrolled, and that was quite a heretical view at that time. And he had a reason for it. He said, look, the only group of industries who are benefiting are the steel rerollers, while the public sector, the large public sector was suffering because of price controls, and then the consumer was suffering because these rerollers, who are the intermediaries, they are making the profits. So he said, look, let us decontrol it. So he was one of the earliest liberalizers. So the point of giving these examples is that Raj was pragmatic. He was not ideologically driven by left or right, and I think that's very important lesson. I think in today's context, that one should be more open to ideas about state and market, open to different ways of coordinating economic mechanisms. And I think this is something, relevance of Raj's writings and his policy advice for the economists who are below 40. I'll stop here. Thank you, Keshav.
Thank you so very much again. Your basic point about like his focus on comparative analysis, I think, as you rightly said, and also I think Geeta also had mentioned similar points. So essentially, kind of to have a broader view of the practical sort of situation, and so very nice to listen to you. So let's now listen to Vijay Shankar, and we will have maybe better discussion after this.
Yeah.
Vijay Shankar, please.
Yes. Thanks, Keshav. I thank Keshav and Odisha Economic Association for this generous invitation you have given me to participate in this meeting. And it's very wonderful to talk about K.N. Raj, who is a kind of a leading light for many of us, both as students, as a teacher, as a policy maker, an institution builder, and so many ways that have been described. Listening to both Geeta and Nagaraj, I am sort of transported from 42 years back to the CDS, when I happened to stray into CDS. I say stray with the meaning that I was never really wanted to, I did not know about the place much. So by series of accidents, by a chance meeting with a friend of mine, I happened to apply. And I was called and I was interviewed. Raj was there in the interview panel, and Geeta also was there in the interview panel, and I got selected. And CDS opened a new world for me entirely. And my life completely changed, I can say, with that September 4, 1982, when I entered CDS. It is in the sense that I was studying I did my master's in a local college in Kerala, Calicut, where I grew up. And the kind of training I got was fairly good by conventional economics of that type, but it was nothing really remotely close to frontline or something, not knowing what is the latest in the discipline. And also the teaching also lacked a lot of depth, I should say, looking at it now, because it was all ancient kind of things which were being taught. So CDS opened a new world, that not only in terms of theory, also in terms of empirics, as Geeta rightly pointed out. Not only Raj, all the other teachers of mine, including Dr. Mandal, Sujita Mandal, Geeta herself, and Dr. Chiranjeev Sen, Chandan Mukherjee, all of them were very grounded people. And a lot of grounding I got from CDS by the time I spent there. Is basically that not to be dogmatic about, or not to be ideological in that ideology sense, but look at data, look at the real world, how things happen and how things change. And I was also fortunate, unlike Nagaraj just mentioned, in fact, Mihir Shah, my colleague, also frequently laments that he was never taught by Raj as such in a classroom. But I was a bit fortunate because Raj had did a course with us called the Macroeconomic Framework for the Indian Economy, a set of 10 lectures, which was supposed to be the book that he was writing, which he promised, but he never wrote. In that lectures, I vividly remember he was a brilliant teacher. So unlike what Geeta was saying, he used to really shine in the class. In our place, at least Raj was already a big figure, so we used to really look forward to his lectures. And he had a specific way of teaching, that he will give us some readings the previous day, maybe one chapter, the original readings, not some articles from here and there. Second plan, one chapter from the second plan, maybe some a piece of one chapter, one short chapter, excerpt chapter from Amiyabachi's book or something. And he asked us to read it. And when we go to the class next day, he will discuss it. First of all, try to understand how much we knew. Of course, we knew nothing, so we are not able to answer his questions anyway. Then he'll sort of pick up one by one all those readings, because he had carefully thought of those readings, and he'll bring all the readings together literally like a clap. I still remember he used to do that. He used to keep his watch on the table and keep for 1, 2, 3 reading and say these 3 readings come together and in this way. So that's a very interesting way of teaching, and constantly harking back to data, empirics, working on the ground. So this training helped me in the sense that when after I left CDS, I went to Madhya Pradesh, Central India. I was, for 30 years of my life, I was in Kerala only. I had never gone out much. I was transported to a new world, another new world called Madhya Pradesh, Central India, kind of a wildlife sanctuary, one should call it. I was, I did not know the language either. But there, all the trainings, all the teachings that I read and heard about in CDS actually helped me a lot. In the sense that I was referring to one particular essay by Dr. Rajkot, Village India and its Political Economy. Village India and its Political Economy, which is a very interesting essay, which actually looked at several village surveys of one particular village called Irvelpattu to that time, and what the surveys actually come out with, pointing to the operation of power structure in the village. Now, I go to a Madhya Pradesh village and I work with tribals. I really know, can see how power structure operates, how this dynamic between tribals and non-tribal, Thakurs versus scheduled castes, all those operate. So this kind of training made me open to those kind of issues. Then there's another paper by Raj, which I think we all of us know, that Peasants and Potatoes. He wrote about basically about commodity markets and MSPs and so on, which again is MSPs are very currently debated hotly. So that paper had very nice, good insights, I would say, between not looking at the category called farmer, Kisan, there's no category. You should look at small farmer, big farmer, tenant farmer, women farmer particularly. All those categories should be looked at, and how one can disaggregate the whole thing and look at the village economy in a differentiated kind of fashion. Third paper I would again refer to Dr. Raj's writings only. The learning that I got is not from Dr. Raj only, from many other people, including teachers like Geeta. But I specifically refer to Dr. Raj's paper because that's the occasion that we are talking about. Third one is his paper on rural credit markets called Keynesian Economics and Agrarian Economies. I tried to read again this time. I'm saying, because I could not understand it full. It's written so densely with so many strands in it and so many types of arguments. It's very difficult to read it even now. And the opening speaker mentioned that Raj did not use economics. I wish somebody goes through that paper and uses the economics, tries to make a model out of it. I'm sure it will be an outstanding kind of model. It's the same kind of writing that Keynes used to do in general theory when he talks of own interest or own that kind of that chapter 17. The same kind of language he has used, and a very interesting paper, which again showed that in rural areas the operation of market is very works in a very different fashion. There is monopoly power. There are money lenders who exercise lots of control of the market, and the interest rate therefore is not a market driven phenomenon. It's something driven by power. That again one gets to know once one goes to villages and look at the pattern of money lending and the kind of power that they operate in multiple markets by what we know as interlinked markets. So these learnings were quite helpful in my own life. For 30 years, I worked in Madhya Pradesh. So many of these instances, the stories or the kind of literature I read, I could relate to my own condition of working in the villages. Raj was also very had a lot of spent a lot of his academic career, academic discussions in discussing what are called price and non-price factors, largely about green revolution technology, the role of technology in an economy, and contrasting that with the agrarian relations, institutional factors. So that interesting. There are lots of writings are there, but I would, in general, feel that he somehow underestimated the power of technology. I mean, he did not give it a due. He thought the revolution will not spread as it has spread right now. It will be largely related to well-endowed areas. It will not reach beyond a certain area. And institutional constraints on agriculture will prevail unless those are removed through land reform or something. Agricultural growth is not going to happen. But as you know, history did not pan out that way. Technology did have a big impact. And here I would also say that Raj was also not very conscious about the negative impact of the technology in the way that we know now, the kind of ecological consequences. When Geeta spoke about inequality, that Raj had, people like the economists of Raj's generation had an idea of inequality in their mind, which did not include, for example, gender, as she mentioned. And it did not, and this entire generation of economists were not aware of ecology much. So just like gender was a big gap in their thinking, I would say ecology was also a very, very big gap in the thinking of economists like Dr. Raj, which is very surprising to me because as both the speakers mentioned, Raj was a very grounded economist. And ecology is ground. Soil is the ecology that you are talking about. Climate is ecology you are talking about. Rainfall is ecology you are talking about. These economists somehow were not aware of these ecological factors. And in fact, one could see ecological factors as shaping or playing a major role in shaping agrarian relations through other factors, of course, caste and other things that Geeta also mentioned, and setting up a certain set of conditions on which technology operates and different trajectories happen. That is a very interesting way, a good way of looking at it, if we were to bring ecology centrally to the picture. I just want to say one more thing here, that ecology, the understanding of ecology was probably not so much within the economists, but it was very much there in the agronomists. 1935 onwards, ICR was there, and a lot of regional stations were there. They were doing a lot of research and lots of details about soil. I mean, they also used to talk about something called manurial problem. That Indian farmers, unlike the Chinese farmers put a lot of manure, farmyard manure into the soil through composting. Indian farmers somehow don't do that. That knowledge was already there, but they saw it as from a technology point of view, as a constraint on agrarian growth, something that need to be removed by, let's say, fertilizer application or something. But if you think a little more about it, you can see the underlying factor is actually ecology. Because Madhya Pradesh, the area where I lived, is a low rainfall area, is a dryland area, rain-fed area, and people have no control over water. So what happens in the agriculture sphere depends purely on the operation of the climatic factors, in which human agency has very limited control. So ecology as a central kind of thing, and that brings us to the question of water also, where I worked most of my life. That there are many areas, many parts of India. In fact, 85% of India would be generally in the category called water scarce, where water is a big problem. So that in such areas, what kind of economies, how do the agrarian economies work there? What are the constraints? How are they overcome? This particular discussion did not figure much in Dr. Raj's analysis, which I think is a surprising gap, but nevertheless a gap which need to be filled. Now I come to the last part of what I'm speaking about is about interregional differences. Taking on from this whole ecology, the way ecology relates to, let's say, social structure, and how social structure relates to other institutions like caste and gender and many other things that is going on in society. How do we look at economic development in a country like India? Raj was very aware that a country of India's dimension, vast dimension like India, the pace of rural transformation, the pace of change will be uneven, will be slow to begin with, and it will also be uneven regionally, depending on all these factors which you just now mentioned. So interregional difference is a very important thing. Dr. Raj did think about that also and had a book on that called The Commercialization of Agriculture. But that was, to my mind, it was a bit caught in this transition narrative, transition from feudalism to capitalism. As if capitalism is a goal that everybody has to reach there, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after, but it's a goal that we have to reach. It's a teleological kind of path they are thinking about. But moving away from that transition narrative, if you actually look at the way changes happen, let's say in Orissa, how the Orissa has changed, Madhya Pradesh, how it has changed, how Kerala has changed over the last 30, 40, 50 years, I think we can find a fantastic variety and a good deal of comparison. Nagaraj is talking about comparing India with China. I'm talking about comparing within India, like between states. And not even states. I'm also talking about, I'm currently working on Madhya Pradesh. I try to write a book on Madhya Pradesh. There are regions within Madhya Pradesh. Now, region is a very specific category. Like in Kerala, you know, there is Malabar and Travancore, etc. These kind of regions are there in every state. So state is an agglomeration. Within the state, there are various regions which have specific ecological, social, cultural, political, and other ideological kind of orientations. How does development happen in this? The same kind of technology, same kind of public investment, same kind of state policies, how they work in these different things, and what kind of matrix does it throw up? It's a very interesting question. And my friend and colleague, my classmate, Tithankar Roy, is trying to write a series of books on different states of India, capturing their experience over the last 50 years. I'm also contributing from my side on Madhya Pradesh. And if you look at that way, we can find that the Kerala model, which we know so much about, which I think nobody has mentioned. I think people are tired of Kerala model, that nobody mentioned the Kerala model, my previous speakers. If you look at that, you can say you can have 100 models within India itself. There is already a Kerala model, Dravidian model people have talked about. There's also the West Bengal model, Gujarat model is also there. Each state or maybe each region, if you look at it, will have very interesting comparative experiences. And these experiences are not interesting or not attractive, or only from the point of view of research. They are very serious policy and actual even working on the ground. I'm not even talking about government policy. An organization like mine, if we were to work in the field, what are the kind of constraints and how do they map out in each region? For example, why can't I be a pure Marxist like in Kerala, in Madhya Pradesh? What is the problem? Why can't I say that I am a CPM? Sorry, left hand. I'm a CPM. Why can't I say that in Madhya Pradesh? There are very severe constraints to that. To understanding those constraints, I think this inter-regional analysis within India is a very, very rich ground, I think, and a lot of regions have undergone tremendous kind of transition over the last 50 years. Even a state like Madhya Pradesh, which is supposed to be stagnant. My argument in the book, which I'm going to write, is that it's not stagnant. It has undergone some dynamics, but not very visible to the outside world. But within that, there has been churning and things are happening. So these are like whatever I learned from Dr. Raj and other teachers in CDS has stood me very well in my and guided me throughout my work over the last 30, 40 years. And it's also opening up new areas, like my opening our eyes to new areas like comparison between regions, the role of ecology, role of gender, migrants is another thing which we don't know much about. Many such issues are there. So I hope that this kind of seminars encourage more people to get grounded rather than sitting in university. They actually get out of the university and get grounded and see the real world, which is changing very fast. Even as we speak, it's changing. I think the dynamics of rural India need to be captured at much greater depth. Thank you. Thanks, Kish. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay Shankar, because you have a fairly different take. I think largely focusing on the challenges in the rural economy broadly, but then within the rural economy also we know that there have been sort of intra-regional variations, and your very sharp point about Raj not quite explicitly focusing on issues relating to the ecological destruction or like challenges facing the local ecology. I think those are very well taken. So actually, in all the three presentations really tell one small thing, that maybe Professor Raj's very wide-ranging interests in things, so ranging from very micro issues to larger sort of international level comparisons and all that. But then with all the three probably also sort of brought out the very pragmatic sort of perspective that Professor Raj had, and sort of trying to I think maybe that is where probably he was always sought after as more in terms of his contribution to policies. at various levels, and maybe that also made him a little bit controversial at some points. But then that also tells us, unless we focus on the changes at the institutional level, so mere economic theory probably doesn't quite help. So what we'll do is we may not have much time for question answer as such, because these are sort of like more sort of views from the three speakers. But if there are any specific questions or comments, maybe very briefly we can sort of take. But before that, I just would request Professor Chandan Mukherjee, if you can just like maybe 2-3 minutes, Professor Chandan Mukherjee, please. And after that, we will sort of open up very quickly. And Chandan, if you don't mind, just say, because you are also very close to Professor Raj for a long time. Chandan, please. I don't know. Professor Chandan Mukherjee, I don't know whether he.
Is it on?
I don't know.
Yeah, sir is present. Yes.
Yeah. Chandan, please, 2 to 3 minutes.
Yeah. Sorry. No, I have to take a break. And meanwhile, you call me.
I'm just before the Q&A, so we have a request, you could speak for 2 to 3 minutes max.
Too many things come to mind, so I don't know where to begin. And this is almost asking without preparation. But I used to work with Professor Raj because I used to help him with all the data work. So one of the things I remember which taught me how to look at data, and that's the only thing I will talk about. He was that time looking at agricultural growth, but by region. So he wanted me to work out some of the growth figures and all. So I was doing that. But when I went back to him, he said, no, why don't you draw the graphs? Time series graph of the various regions. So I went back, and then I thought I had joined CDS just out of Indian Statistical Institute. So all the muscles of statistical theory was working in my head. But drawing graph, too simplistic way of looking at it. Anyway, I went and drew the graph. So Raj, what he did, he stood in front of the window and put one graph page on another and juxtaposing it, and started working out the lag of various periods. Normally, an econometrician will bang in a model to work out the lags. But he worked out the lag, and later people talked about that lag much closer to what Raj was talking about, the lag in the agricultural growth that was taking place. So that is one thing I remember that, and I learned that this is really what you might call the grounded way of looking at things. And this still remains with me, that Raj standing in front of the window, putting one graph on top of the other, moving them and working out the lag. And then finally he wrote the paper based on that. And that's one thing it still remains very fresh in my mind. I'll stop with that.
Okay, thank you. That was Professor Chandan Mukherjee. He was at CDS for a long time, and then is a very, very well-known, distinguished development statistician, if I may say so. So now the floor is open for brief questions, comments. Anyone, please.
Yeshua, perhaps I'd like to say something while we're waiting for people to think about questions.
Yeah.
And that is just clarify something. because all of us have been speaking about Raj being very grounded, very empirical, drawing from the ground, and then, drawing out lessons there, from that. But I think it's really important to realize that it's not a kind of, if I may call it, innocent approach to the ground, because the ground is a million things. How do you know what to look at? How do you know what of this reality? Even if you say, and this is particularly, I think, important if there are any young students with us today, it's not that, everything, it just suggests itself to you. Raj was very deeply read, and very, very profoundly understanding of many, many different streams of thinking and writing. And out of that, he had a frame, which is what I was trying to say earlier, for making economy, with which he looked at the ground. But it was not a dogmatic frame. It was a frame that said, inequality is important, class is important, caste is important. It works in these different ways. History changes over time, which allowed him to be flexible but also gave him it. I think his frame was a flexible structure. And that's what made his ability then to decide what to look at on the ground, gave meaning to that groundedness. So it's not a kind of, the ground suggests what you should think about on its own. Of course it does, but if you don't have some frame with which you come to it, and the frame should not be, and in Raj's case was not, a dogmatic frame. It was a frame put together from deep reading, analysis, and understanding of many things. And you can't do it without that. And I think that was where it's actually quite a difficult approach. But that then made it possible for him to do the kind of thing that Chandan just spoke about. He sort of knew what he was looking for, but he was looking to see whether it was there. And that then gave meaning, I think. So it's as much, if there are young students, please read, even if you don't agree. Please challenge what you read, question what you read. It's the questioning stance that was really, really important, I think, for all of us, whether we were students or faculty at CDS.
So, anyone wants to ask a question or something, or I may request Pulin sir, you want to make any comment because you also.
Okay. Briefly, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Now, I was a student at the Delhi School of Economics from 69 to 71. And I was an undergraduate student in Delhi University from 66 to 69. So K. N. Raj was a known figure at that time. When I joined in 69, K. N. Raj gave us a few lectures, MA previous, a few lectures, and then he soon became the Vice Chancellor of Delhi University. But some mention has already been made of the fact that after joining as Vice Chancellor of Delhi University, Raj was confronted with an emerging right-wing major party of that time, the Janasangh, which now has the form after several changes in the Bharatiya Janata Party. But Janasangh of Balraj Madhok, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and so on. Those were the initial names. And Raj came in for a lot of difficulty, and finally he decided to quit as the vice chancellor, and he shifted to Kerala and set up the CDS. But one or two things I do want to mention about Raj. You see, Raj joined the Delhi School of Economics in '53 as professor of monetary economics. And when he joined, he was a very young man. He was barely 29, very unusual in those times. But his brilliance was already known. He was a brilliant expositor. He was not a great theorist, and the word grounded has been used for him. But V.K.R.V. Rao had made a promise to K.N. Raj to induct him into the Delhi School of Economics. There were some difficulties when K.N. Raj actually finished his PhD and came back, and the act could not be immediately taken up. Finally, in 1953, there was a period in which Raj went to Sri Lanka as a journalist, and then RBI also, Bombay, then he worked there briefly. And then finally he came to the Planning Commission and wrote out much of the first 5-year plan, the text of it, much of it by K.N. Raj. And he became very close to Nehru, who was following the drafting, etc., very closely. In '53, Raj joined as professor of monetary economics at the Delhi School of Economics. It was very unusual, but he joined, and he was a huge success as a professor because he was a great expositor, intellectually very strong. And the founder, of course, was V.K.R.V. Rao of Delhi School of Economics. There were some differences of how exactly Delhi School of Economics ought to be managed, and all these things slowly took some kind of shape. But in '57, V.K.R.V. Rao joined Delhi University as the vice chancellor. So he shifts out from the Delhi School of Economics as such. By that time, the D School building had already been constructed. Earlier on, after its foundation in '49, it was operating from the Arts Faculty building. In '56, the Delhi School of Economics building was constructed, brand new building. There were donations from the Billas and certain other business houses. Billas had donated a lakh of rupees, etc., and some other donations were also there. Now, what I want to say is this: from that point onwards, K.N. Raj becomes very important and a central figure in the intellectual growth of the Delhi School of Economics. And in '59, the sociology department comes in. But more important now, Raj was the director when in 1963, 3 appointments were made. And those were the appointments of Amartya Sen, Sukumar Chakravarti, and Jagdish Bhagwati. And these were all done at the time of K.N. Raj as being director and the head of the economics department. And Amartya Sen had already established himself in his very young age, at his very young age. Then he was already an internationally known figure and a person of a very high level of intellectual achievement already, not only in economics, but also in philosophy and so forth. He already had a paper in mind in philosophy when he was in his early 20s, etc. And Sen, anyone who cares to read Sen's autobiography, for example, Home in the World, you will read about V.K.R.V. Rao. You'll also read about K.N. Raj. The person Amartya Sen mentions repeatedly is K.N. Raj. It is Raj's leadership, and it is his intellectual leadership that Amartya Sen was attracted to. And finally, Amartya Sen moves to the Delhi School of Economics from his professorship again at a very early and young age at Jadavpur University. He shifts to Delhi School of Economics in 63. But soon after that, Jagdish Bhagwati and then Shukuma Chakravarti. Now, these three individuals were theorists of the first order in the international arena. Their papers were coming out in Econometrica, Review of Economic Studies, Economica, American Economic Review, and so forth. They were first-rate scholars. Raj had no difficulty in thinking of these individuals as the young people who will sort of set off Delhi School on its intellectual passage. So that is one aspect I did want to mention about K.N. Raj. One final thing I'll mention, time is short and some others would want to speak. After he became vice chancellor, you see, Delhi University was an old style university then, and department heads used to be department heads, and they would rule for any number of years. There was no fixity to their term. Raj brought in the notion of fixed term, 3 years as the head of the department, and rotational headship, etc. And he brought in many other democratic features in his very short tenure as Vice Chancellor of Delhi University. So Delhi University faculty members remember K.N. Raj and his very short tenure as a person who brought in democratization into the academic world in Delhi University. I can say much more, but I do not want to, and I will close here. Time is short, so some other people.
Thank you so very much. I think this is very, very extremely interesting part that you said it because you have been there. And his days in Delhi, probably we did not quite know all these details. So thank you so very much, students, sir. So there's two Vijay Shankar, you want to ask something, and then
yeah, Keshav, my thing is very brief. I mean, we mentioned Raj as an institutional builder and mentioned two institutions, one Delhi School of Economics and the Center for Development Studies. There is another third institution which is very closely associated with Dr. Raj, that is the Economic and Political Weekly. I just want to bring that onto the table for the people who may not know that Sachin Chaudhary started the Economic Journal, Economic Weekly, then which did not run for a long time, it collapsed. But 1966, it was put back into on rails by the new name, the Economic and Political Weekly. And I believe Raj and many others contributed significantly in terms of writing op-eds and getting articles and writing themselves in that journal and making it into what we know it as today. So I think in setting up that institution also, I think Dr. K.N. Raj had a major role. I just want to say that. Thank you.
Lakshmikant, you want to say something? Sebastian.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Good evening to all the distinguished speakers and the participants. I am Lakshmikant Gwel, a PhD research scholar at the School of Humanities and Social Science, Niger, Bhubaneswar. My question is, to all the distinguished speakers, particularly to Professor Nagaraj, that he mentioned that Professor Raj was not driven by ideological stand while choosing between state and markets. Rather, he sees the situations in practice, and then he supports market or state. If you look at the current scenario of the development of India as well as the world, that rising inequality within democratic structure has been a pressing issue for the last 30 or 40 years. Now, in the capitalistic order, inequality is inevitable. And some variants of the capitalistic theory, like the trickle-down theory, says that the growth percolates down over the period of time to poor regions. But it is not happening. And democracy as a political system is widely accepted by many countries over the last 30-40 years as a check to this rising inequality. But today, rising inequality within the democratic structure has been, very concerned. So, is the theory of Raj or philosophy of Raj works to address the rising inequality within the democratic structure? And the second question is, he used to compare.
Make it little pointed. I think it's because time issue is there. So make it little brief and pointed. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, my second question is, most of us mentioned about the cross-country analysis that Professor Raj used to compare between India and China. But today, if you look at regional disparity, especially I am talking about Odisha, within district blocks are at different levels of development. To address regional disparity, what are the philosophies of Professor Raj in this regard? I like to request you enlighten on this. Thank you.
And so shall we take one more question from Gilbert, and then I will sort of wait for the speakers to respond. Gilbert, why don't you please ask briefly?
Okay. Hello.
Yes.
See,
Yeah.
I listened to a couple of speeches, Nagaraj and Professor Pulin Nayak. So what I feel is that, you see, we need to have a balanced appreciation of K.N. Raj's legacy. And we should not be just, just praising him. We should not be having only a one-sided view of K.N. Raj, because you see, for example, Professor Nagaraj was saying that he was pragmatic. He was not ideologically driven. Now, pragmatism itself is an ideology. Pragmatism, and it is not actually taken in a very positive sense. I mean, because pragmatism has led to so many disasters. Say, for example, in American military policy, pragmatism has led to a lot of disasters because it had a lot of long-term consequences. And similarly, his understanding, he was actually very ideological in his approach in running Center for Development Studies, for example, because he wanted to completely avoid people with Marxist leanings, because he took a Keynesian Kaleskian kind of approach, and he wanted to completely avoid people who were having a Marxist leaning. So that way he was very ideologically bent, but then in a wrong way, because the intermediate regime which he argued about was not applicable to the case of India if we look at the empirical facts or the reality. It was not at all applicable to the case of India, Kaleski's model of intermediate regime. So I think we need to have on his 100th birth anniversary, we need to have a more balanced, or it cannot be balanced. It can be a dialectical kind of approach about K.N. Raj's legacy. Professor Kunyaman, who just passed away, he had very critical take on K.N. Raj.
I'm very sorry to be interrupting you.
I just stopped. Okay.
I think your point is made. So any other? Sorry. So maybe I request the speakers to briefly respond to. Chandan, you want to ask something? Say something?
No, I just wanted to tell this gentleman who spoke just now.
Yeah.
Professor Krishnaji was on the faculty of CDS. He was a Marxist. There was CPC Chandrasekhar. He was a Marxist. So Raj did not have any aversion to Marxists at all.
Thomas Isaac.
But Thomas Isaac was
Thomas
a
Isaac.
student and a teacher.
So this is very wrong
so
to
many
say
people, it's
Professor
very
Raj
unfair
had.
to say that Raj did not have Marxist in CDS. It's not at all true. There's so many people I know. Chandan Mukherjee himself, what do you think he is? He's not a Marxist. He's the director of CDS.
No.
Oops.
It's completely wrong thing you're saying. I think the information is wrong. It's not true.
So maybe the responses from the three speakers very briefly.
I'll just, Keshav, I'll make a point about the interregional differences. I'm glad that a person brought it up, the PhD scholar. That is exactly the right thing I was saying, that Raj talked about interregional difference between India and China. We later on talk about the regional differences within India. So I am also saying that more of such work is required. There is tremendous scope. Odisha itself, you were talking about, there is coastal Odisha and western Odisha. I've gone to western Odisha villages. I know how they are a world apart from coastal Odisha. Similarly, similar regions we can find in every state. Madhya Pradesh has at least 3 or 4 regions which are completely separate, different from each other. We are talking about district and block and all that. We can talk at a regional level, which is within state, let's 4 or 5 large chunks. Punjab has a huge regional diversity. All these formations are diversity, and that is exactly the way we should go. And we should need more studies which bring out these differences to the forefront and also highlight the kind of inequalities that they foster because of this. The inequality between, let's say, coastal Odisha and western Odisha is huge, very, very significant. Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe Nagaraj, you have to.
I think, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think the inequality. I think the PhD scholar asked an interesting question. Yes, but you see, capitalism is not of only one kind. I mean, capitalism, within capitalism, if you see across the world, you have inequalities varying very much. You have a European kind of capitalism where you have much less inequality, or even say Japanese or East Asian where inequalities are much less. And of course, if you take the Brazilian. So just to say that capitalism and inequalities go together, and I think that's a true, very large, very big generalization. So one has to be more specific about what does democracy necessarily bring about equality. I don't know, but there are enormous variations across the world. So to make a categorical statement is harder. I think it requires a more sharper posing of question, and also this changes over time. I mean, there are phases even in the advanced countries where inequalities have risen, and there are phases when they have declined. So I think we have to be more careful about making these points. I would stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Geeta, please.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. One, just picking up from Nagraj about inequality. I think the relationship, what happens to inequality under capitalism depends very much on what the state is doing. And I think that's exactly, capitalist states are not the same everywhere. And they're not the same everywhere because the nature of classes and class struggle is not the same everywhere, to use that language. So there is huge variety and variation both over time and across space. The one thing you can certainly say is if the state decides not to play a role to mitigate and reduce inequality, and if the state doesn't have a longer term perspective, which sees that inequality in a sense is bad for capitalism in the long run, then you will get a huge increase in inequality. If the state abrogates its role, you will certainly see that. But that's not the case everywhere. And that is the nature of the difference. I just want to say one thing, which in response to this question of not deifying Raj, I don't think anybody is deifying Raj here. And in a sense, I think why I said what I said the previous time as well, is that Raj's pragmatism, so-called, was not a quote-unquote innocent pragmatism. It's not like, like a child, he looked at the world and said, oh, he was one of the most deeply read persons on every kind of ideology that I know. And he could pull out of his library stuff that came from across ideological spectrum. Of course, he had his own views on that, but he certainly allowed himself to grapple with those ideas and to test them against what he could perceive as reality from the ground. So that groundedness meant that flexible frame, but it was a political economy frame with which he approached the groundedness of reality. And you're absolutely right if you think that Raj objected to dogmatism of all kinds. And I remember one of the favorite stories, that I've heard him tell more than once, when he was in an argument with EMS. EMS said, well, if the class struggle, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact words, requires me to say that 2 + 2 is not 4, I will say it. And Raj was horrified by that. He said 2 + 2 is 4, no matter what your dogma or ideology might be. And if somehow your dogma or ideology are not fitting to where you can say 2 + 2 is 4, then something's wrong with your dogma or ideology. And you better start questioning what it is that is driving you there, because that's simply not true. And I think that was the power of his approach.
Keshav, you're on mute. You're muted, Keshav.
Oh, you're muted.
Sir, please unmute. Keshav sir, please unmute.
Keshav, you're muted.
I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry. No, I was just saying that this particular event has been this meeting has been very, very unusual in the sense of the very eminent speakers that we have and very eminent personalities also in the audience. It's not like a typical event in which someone makes a presentation and questions and answers are there. And we're also dealing with a person who had very multifarious interest, and maybe he has touched lives of different people very, very differently. But then as we are sort of coming to an end of this particular meeting, and before I request the President, Professor Abhinav Patra, to conclude this, and being part of the Odisha Economic Association, one person comes to my mind, and I'm sure many others would remember, that is Shakti Padhi. He was one of his dearest students, and he's no more with us, but I certainly remember, and at times, at a very personal level, I sort of find a link to Professor Raj, because I happened to be the first PhD student of Shakti Padhi, who was a student to Professor K.M. Raj. So with that, very, very interesting discussion that we had. Maybe this also sort of provokes us to rethink and maybe to write more about a person like Professor Raj. And with that, I request Professor Ravina, please.
Thank you, Professor Das. I have nothing to add because we have listened so much that it is very difficult to conclude. It is rather inconclusive. It goes on. One thing I marked that is unusual, as Keshav sir has said, and that is it is a perspective mixed with emotions. I have seen that many the speakers are many. They wanted to say many more things, but time was the constraint. It was very emotions mixed with perspectives and emotions mixed with economics. And that is the say hallmark of this today's meeting. I am very much thankful to the speakers, and I hope if in future we will make requests to them to address us they will not say be hesitant and they will not frustrate us. With this hope, I will now request our Secretary Amarendra to offer a formal vote of thanks, and then we will close. Thank you.
No, again, since we have gone very long, and so I would like to just thank all the panelists who could join with us, and starting from uh, Professor Gita Sen to Professor Vijay Shankar to Professor R. Nagaraj and Pulin sir and so and also Professor Chandan Mukherjee. In fact, Professor Chandan Mukherjee, I just messaged him in a very short notice. Although we had earlier email exchanges, I had forgotten him to remind him. But no, I'm really grateful to all of you that you joined with us, and I sincerely thank Professor Kesav Das who could connect with all the speakers, and for which actually they all agreed also. So, and thank you, Rabi sir, for presiding over this meeting. And thank you all the participants who could join with us on this Sunday evening. Thank you so much. I think with this we can conclude.